Thank you, Kevin. I'm glad we have a quorum. You never know when you're speaking, you think, gee, how many people are actually going to come back? You know? So, my wife is going to, I'm sure, be a good sound monitor for me, but I think it's going to be easier for me to project today.
Oh, definitely. You're louder already.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Well, let me give you a little bit of a summary, very briefly, about what we talked about yesterday. We talked first about what apologetics is, because the title of my curriculum is Apologetics, Scripture and Science, a Biblical Worldview. So we talked about what apologetics is. We talked about the purpose that I have in the course, the 4 purposes for the use of apologetics, why apologetics is important. We talked about the 2 main worldviews that exist out there in the whole area of creation. And we talked about the 2 fundamental scientific laws of the universe, the first 2 laws of thermodynamics, really critical to confirming many things with respect to there being a creator of the universe. Then we talked about evidence for a creator in cosmology. We talked about some desperation theories that are out there. We're going to talk about some more desperation theories today. We gave a summary of the 8 areas where cosmology confirms Scripture, and we left off with evidence for a creator in the area of astronomy. So we've been moving from the macro, the area of cosmology, the whole of the universe, focusing then more specifically to astronomy, which is the heavenly bodies. And today we're going to start to talk about, very briefly today, physics, and then move on from there to geology and origins of life. So let's talk first about, briefly, evidence for a creator in physics. And physics covers both the macro and the micro, everything from cosmology right down to subatomic particles, big scope for the area of physics. So let's look at Colossians. I'll just read it to you. Colossians 1:16-17. For by him all things, that's the macro to the micro, were created that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible, the macro, and invisible, the subatomic particles, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers, all things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things consist. Do you note that Paul says all things 4 times? He's trying to get it across to us very clearly that our God is the one who has done it all. There is no wiggle room for us or for anyone else. So what is physics? There's 2 definitions I'll give to you today. There's probably more. One is the branch of science concerned with the nature and properties of matter and energy. And another is the science that deals with matter, energy, motion, and force. Here's an interesting area that I want to talk to you about briefly today. There are what are called constants in physics. And the definition of a constant in physics is a quantity or a condition or a factor that does not change or vary in specified circumstances. There are over 30 of these constants in physics, and they are critically significant in giving evidence for a creator of the universe. I'll give you 2 examples. One constant, an example of a constant, is the speed of light in a vacuum. It is a constant factor, a constant speed. And another is the force of gravity. But as I say, there are 30 of these constants. Connected with these constants is what's called, and this has been coined by scientists, the anthropic principle. And these constants connect with the anthropic principle. The source of the word, as many of you know, of anthropic is from anthropos, the Greek word for man. And the anthropic principle simply says this, that these constants in physics have one thing in common. They are the exact, precise values that are needed to have a universe capable of enabling and sustaining life. And the effects of these constants show something else that scientists refer to, and that is the fine-tuning of the universe, which points us to the fact that because of this fine-tuning, there is intelligent design in the universe. That is a creator. If these constants were not so precise and so finely tuned, life could simply not exist on Earth. And we have to contrast this with the whole naturalist viewpoint that says everything that came about just came about through these random forces, through these processes that just happened to occur, completely contrary to the idea of precision and fine-tuning.
In other words, chaos became orderly
Exactly.
on its own.
Yes, I mean, that's the whole concept, which makes no sense. I'm going to talk to you about only 3 of these constants today, just to do this briefly. First, the gravitational constant. The gravitational constant determines the force of gravity. How precise is it? It is mind-bogglingly precise. So let me read you some of these. You people who are math experts will know this better than I do. But a change of 1 in 10 to the 40th power in this constant, the gravitational constant, and life is impossible. Okay, so what is 10 to the 40th power? It is 10 multiplied by itself 40 times. 10 times 10 times 10, and it keeps multiplying itself.
10 with 40 zeros after it.
It is huge. How big is this? Well, consider this. There are 37.2 trillion cells, give or take a few million, in the human body. That is 10 to the 14th power. 1 in 10 to the 40th power equals 10,000 billion, billion, billion times a billion. 10 to the 14th power is just 1,000 times a billion. It's just a small number. But you see, this factor of 10 to the 40th power is incomprehensibly larger than the 37.2 trillion cells that are in our body. So here's a comparison that has been made. I wish I came up with it. I didn't. I'm just repeating it. But here's a comparison of a change of 1 out of 10 to the 40th numbers. Any of you remember, only old guys like me will remember this, the old radios that had the old radio dials and all the tick marks?
Yeah.
So here's the comparison that's been given. If you took a dial like that and you went across from 1 to 10 to the 40th in number, starting with the known force of gravity up to only twice the force of gravity, this would represent 10,000 billion, 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 billion evenly spaced tick marks. Get this. Imagine those number of tick marks. If you moved that dial, if it was a radio dial, by only 1 tick mark out of 10,000 billion, 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 life would be impossible.
Wow.
I mean, this is how precise this is. Compare this with this concept that everything that's occurred has occurred through some random force. Talk to you briefly about the electromagnetic force and the speed of light. The electromagnetic force is the force that's involved with electrical and magnetic fields. If the electromagnetic force were only minutely larger or smaller, life would be impossible. If the speed of light were only minutely faster or slower, life would be impossible. I've left out some that are even bigger than 10 to the 40th. There are a number of them, and they just get more boggling, but you get the picture. So, chance? Has this occurred by chance? You see, these constants demonstrate this fine-tuning of the universe for life. To say that this happened by chance requires more of a certain kind of faith than it does to believe that there's a God.
Yeah.
In fact, there's a guy, his last name is Turek, who's written a book, and he says, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. Good line. So, how are these constants held together? I mean, think of it now. If everything is on such a razor-sharp edge of fine-tuning, you might ask, well, why does it not fly apart? Well, that's simply because, as Hebrews says, everything is upheld by the word of his power. By the word of his power. So on the one hand, everything's finely tuned, but on the other hand, he holds it all together. I'm going to read you only one conclusion with respect to the area of physics by a world-class scientist. And this is Sir Fred Hoyle. He's an internationally renowned physicist. He was knighted by the Queen in England for his work in physics, and he's not a believer. But here's what he says. A common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces, read chance, worth speaking about in nature. This guy's not even a believer. Let's leave physics. I think it's speaking for itself. I want to move now, coming down from physics to evidence for a creator in geology. Now we're coming to planet Earth. Let's read a scripture that it will be foundational to what I want to talk about today in the area of geology. Genesis 7:10-12, New King James Version. And it came to pass after 7 days that the waters of the flood were on the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, this is getting pretty precise, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, and the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. This statement that there was a worldwide catastrophic flood is foundational to what we're going to see in the area of geology, which in turn will be a proof, a substantive proof of the fact that there is a God and that the scriptures were correct when it talks about the flood. So let's look at the age of the earth for the moment to start off with. True science does not contradict a 6-day creation. It can't prove a 6-day creation, but it can't disprove a 6-day creation. The age of the earth cannot be proved or disproved by science. Very simply, it's because there was no human evidence or observation of the creation. Nobody was there then. All everybody is doing, both on the creationist side, the intelligent design side, and on the side of naturalism, is going back to unobserved events, taking a look at current events, how current things happen in the area of geology, and then saying, well, we think this is what happened in the past. Nobody was there. So we're looking now in this whole area for the best evidence in the area of geology. So there are two fundamental approaches to geological forces on Earth. Catastrophism is one, and gradualism is the other. So here's basically a summary of catastrophism. It says that major, rapid geological changes occur through catastrophic events. They are of high energy and short duration. So give me some examples of these types of catastrophic events that we see in operation from time to time on Earth.
Like
Hurricanes.
Hurricanes, you guys are clicking right in, of course, it's close to home.
Tsunamis.
Tsunamis, yes. Earthquakes.
Volcano eruptions.
Yes, although yes, and that's potentially so, that's right. And somebody said volcanic activity.
Yeah. Tornadoes.
Yep, and of course, floods.
Floods, yeah.
Earth's geology, through the best evidence, clearly shows evidence of these catastrophic events, in particular a worldwide flood. We'll talk about that in a moment. But gradualism, the other approach, the approach of naturalists, those who do not believe in a creator, or also called uniformitarianism, same kind of idea, says the opposite. What they say is that the forces that shape the earth are only gradual natural processes that occurred over what they call deep time, that is billions of years. And they say this as well, and this is an important point in their approach, is they say that past events and processes and current ones are all the same. Everything that happened in the past has occurs today at the same rate in the same fashion. There's no difference, ever. It's all constant, it's all uniform, hence the word uniformitarianism. And of course they say that there was no worldwide flood. There may have been some local floods, but they deny a worldwide flood. So examples that they might give is to say, well, the Colorado River and the Grand Canyon. This huge gaping canyon, they will say, started by this narrow ribbon of a river that was at the top of what is now the canyon, and over billions of years, little by little, it slowly eked a bigger and bigger and bigger separation in the rocks till we have this huge separation we have today. We'll talk more about how plausible that is in a short bit. So then we've got these two approaches. So how does the actual evidence stack up for catastrophism on the one hand and gradualism on the other. Let me give you a little bit of background to both of these approaches. From ancient times, basically back in biblical times, to about 1800, or in the 1800s, there was an acceptance generally by scientists and everyone of catastrophism and what they call flood geology. Everybody said very clearly, there's obviously been a catastrophic worldwide flood. Some of them based it on biblical grounds, others based it upon purely observations and evidence that they saw on the earth. Of course, it's clearly set out in the Old and New Testament, and early Christian writers wrote about this. One who's a household word to all of you, no doubt, Tertullian. Me either. He was an early Christian writer who found that there were fossils in the high hills in his area and said this is clearly evidence, because these are seashells that he was observing, that there had been a flood in the past. Nicholas Steno, in the 1600s, he is a flood geologist, a Christian, and he was actually is considered one of the founders of modern geology, and he was the guy who proved that fossils were the remains of living creatures. Up to that point, it wasn't quite certain. And in his writings, again, he is a foundational geologist. He is a heavy hitter. He said there is clear evidence of a biblical flood because of these fossils that kept being found at high elevations. Then there was a switch. From about the 1800s to 1960, there was a movement from catastrophism to this uniformitarianism, or uniformitarian geology. But it was based, and this is really important, on worldview, not on science. What do you think was the worldview that tipped this change? 1800s. Pardon?
Evolution, Charles Darwin.
Absolutely right. This was the area of Charles Darwin and evolution. And because this worldview was now saying, guys, it's really clear that there has been evolutionary processes, there is no creator, there's long gradual processes, there's no catastrophism. This all occurred because you got huge chunks of time, and you've got matter, and you've got that good old force chance that created this. So geology was seen through the lens of Darwinism. But in 1962, and up to the current date, there's been a resurgence of catastrophism, and it's not based on worldview, because this resurgence actually comes through the viewpoints of people who are Christians and non-Christians alike in geology. It's based on evidence in geology, and it's based on there being evidence of a global flood. So let me look at some of this evidence. I want to talk a bit about the evidence of a global flood in the Grand Canyon and some other structures. So naturalists, as I mentioned to you before, assume that these processes in geology and these rates have been the same all this time. It's an assumption that they can't make, interestingly enough. It's again just based on worldview, because nobody was there to see what the rates of processes were in the past compared to what they are today. Anybody here been to the Grand Canyon? Yeah, I have too. Sharon has. When you look at the Grand Canyon and you look at the Colorado River, it's intuitively clear that the Colorado River didn't cause the Grand Canyon as it is today. So let's look at, and this is an area that's really interesting, evidence in the sedimentary rock layer. So what is sedimentary rock? Most of you probably know what it is. But it is when water carries various particles, sand and other dirt particles with it. And when the water slows down and those particles precipitate out and go down, and there's an evaporation of the water, what happens? It forms rock, sedimentary rock, when it hardens. Examples of sedimentary rock: sandstone, shale, limestone, which you see in various areas of the world. The interesting thing is that in North America and most of the continents of the world, there is clear evidence of this sedimentary rock. And it's rock that has been deposited by powerful water forces, not just slow-moving forces. So the Grand Canyon, a perfect example of sedimentary rock. It gives an outstanding example of this because you've got these cuts down the side of the canyon, and you can clearly see the layers upon layers. It's a geologist's dream. So in the Grand Canyon, this is interesting. What they call the basement rocks of the Grand Canyon are also known as Precambrian rock. That is a layer of rock that's sort of at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. And it's non-layered. It contains no fossils whatsoever. But above and right upon these basement rocks, these Precambrian rocks, is a 4,000 foot thick layer or layers of sedimentary sheets from what they call the Tapeats sandstone, the immediate first one above the Precambrian rock, to the top of what they call the Kaibab limestone. And these layers of sedimentary rock, 4,000 feet in the Grand Canyon, that has been deposited by powerful water forces of some kind, occurs worldwide. It's clear evidence that at one time there was an ocean above the continents. And the other interesting thing is when they look at these layers of sedimentary rock, even geologists say there obviously are very short time frames between these layers of rock. We're not talking millions of years between all these 4,000 feet of sedimentary rock layers. And scientists who believe that there is clear evidence of a global flood say that this 4,000 foot layer could actually clearly and easily have been deposited within the biblical time frame of the flood, based upon the description of the flood. And they base this upon geological observation. So here's an interesting further note with respect to this. So you've got these basement rocks, the Precambrian rock, no fossils, no layers. Then right over this you start with 4,000 feet thick of sedimentary rock. But between the basement rock, the Precambrian, and the next layer, right on top of this Precambrian rock, the rock has been scoured flat by some huge erosional force. This is called the Great Unconformity. It is found worldwide, and it separates this sandstone, 4,000 feet of it, from the Precambrian rock. What would cause a scouring of this lower basement rock? Well, the only thing that could was a huge erosional force. Here's another interesting thing, and by the way, this is globally. You see this great unconformity on a global basis. This is not in a limited area. It's not just found in the Grand Canyon. It's found everywhere. So why? What could possibly cause this? The evidence is really clear to geologists, based on the understanding of catastrophism, is that this Tapeats sandstone and everything above it was deposited by force very quickly. This is not a slow process on the Precambrian rock. There's another interesting aspect to this. They find that this Tapeats sandstone has been bent vertically, but it hasn't broken. How could you bend a rock with huge force without it being broken? Well, the answer is you couldn't. It would shatter. So the conclusion is pretty clear that this Tapeats sandstone was bent when it was soft, when it was not yet hardened. That is when this huge process of water came in to cause this to be the case. It was bent when it was soft and newly deposited, not a billion years ago, not a couple of million years ago, but currently during the process of whatever deposited it. Here's the other interesting thing, is that in this whole area of this sedimentary rock, and in this Tapeats sandstone in particular, they find huge boulders just deposited through these layers. But these boulders they find, because they know the nature and composition of them, were not from the Grand Canyon area. They've been carried from thousands of miles away. What could carry huge boulders thousands of miles away and deposit them within this sandstone rock of the Grand Canyon? Obviously a huge force had to do that. Here's an interesting little note with respect to, again, this force that's carried the composition of this sandstone. So I said this Tapeats sandstone is 4,000 feet. The upper 2,000 feet of it, geologists have examined and find that does not come from the Grand Canyon area at all, or anywhere remotely near it. Guess where it comes from? The Appalachians, fully 2,000 miles away. The whole 2,000 foot upper layer of this sandstone has been carried from 2,000 miles away. Some huge force has done that. And in fact, geologists have noted that in the western U.S., virtually all of the sedimentary deposits come from the far eastern U.S. Another interesting note, I said to you that the Precambrian rock has no fossils, right?
Right.
No layers, no fossils. The Cambrian rock is full of fossils. Would this be consistent with and make sense with respect to a biblical flood?
Well, yeah.
If you got stuff that has been deposited by force by water, and if the biblical flood occurred as we said it would, what happened to the creatures in the flood?
Right.
They were killed in the flood, which explains perfectly why this sandstone is just riddled with all kinds of dead bodies of animals. The flood killed the existing life that was on earth at that point. Everything totally consistent with a worldwide catastrophic flood.
So they see, so in, okay, I'm trying to get a picture of all this. They see fossils, they see bones and stuff embedded in this rock?
Embedded in the rock.
In the Grand Canyon?
In the Grand Canyon. All kinds of it, except for these basement layers, which is
Right.
the original rock
Which is
layer.
the original.
The original rock layer,
That's
when creation first occurred, right? So here's an interesting picture. You know, oftentimes, and I mean, I think I've thought this before, I think a lot of Christians have thought this, we say, okay, we look at the flood and we say, huge amount of water. It's kind of like somebody left their tap running and went on vacation, right? Lots of water came from up, lots of water came from down, and basically just a lot of water floating around and everybody drowned. That's not the dynamics of the flood alone. And as geologists have examined this and looked at it more carefully, they say, look, during the time that the flood took place, there would be huge tectonic plate movements, you know, with the tectonic plates in the earth that slide around. Because what did it say? It said the fountains of the great deep pressed up. The water split these areas of the rock from underneath. So what would happen there? The rocks are being moved aside by tremendous force and the tectonic plates are moving. What would result naturally from that? Things like earthquakes. What would result naturally in the water? Obviously things like tsunamis, because you've got
Right.
huge force that's moving everything.
Right, tsunamis, yeah.
It explains now why these areas of rock are being carried huge distances. It wasn't just some kind of heavy rain. So let's look at, for a moment, at fossils in the Grand Canyon. Now, I mean, we know there's fossils in the rock records. But when you think of it today, there's lots of animals that are continually dying on Earth all over the place, both on land and under the water. How many fossils are you seeing? Probably about zero. So how do fossils form? Well, fossils have to occur when they're well preserved from something that's called avalanche deposits. They have to be rapidly buried, and here's the reason. The oxygen has to be pushed out. They have to actually have no oxygen around them. They have to be buried, and that's the only way they can be preserved. Because as soon as oxygen occurs in the process, you've got oxidation. It
Okay.
begins to now cause deterioration of the
Right,
tissues. That's why
right,
we don't see
right.
fossils today, unless it's through some catastrophic process like was described in the flood. So the whole area of fossils being established and preserved can only occur through a catastrophic process. It can't occur through long, slow, gradual processes. Fossils in the Grand Canyon. Nearly all of them are shellfish and from different regions. Again, they don't come from and they're not native to the Grand Canyon. Geologists, paleontologists say that they are from other regions. They were carried in, all consistent with what a flood did. There's an area in the Grand Canyon that actually runs from the Grand Canyon to Las Vegas. You can bet on that. I know, it's really terrible, but you're so gracious to us. So gracious. In this area, it's called the Red Wall Limestone. They find billions of nautiloids, and these are marine creatures with a shell, something like an octopus and squid. They find billions of them that have suddenly been killed in this Red Wall Limestone. So again, all this is confirmation of what we see in Scripture about the global flood. Let me switch to another area related to the Grand Canyon, but it's another area of evidence. Among the Native American tribes in the Grand Canyon, several of them, there are flood stories. So how did the flood stories occur? Well, the interesting thing about these flood stories is that they were produced by and recorded by these Native American tribes before there was any connection with European settlers, before there was any connection whatsoever with the scriptures. It's not that they received the scriptures and then they established their pictographs based upon what they heard. This was before they had any of that evidence. So listen to one of these. And I'll mangle the pronunciation, I'm sure. The Hualapai tribe have pictographs, and here's what they show. 45 days of rain with water rising. The water covers everything on earth except the old man on the mountain. And then the next pictograph shows that a bird was sent by the Creator once, and then a bird was sent a second time with grass in its mouth. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah.
That sounds familiar. The next one might not be quite as familiar, but then a man is directed to dig a hole with a ram's horn and water is drained off the earth. Ram's horn actually is pretty significant in Scripture, though, as we know. And at the end of the pictograph, the sun is shown coming out, and people now start to disperse over all the earth.
Wow, that's something.
How's them apples?
Yeah.
But where did they get that from?
Well, I would say by revelation.
Yeah, God revealed, like it says in the scripture, He reveals.
He reveals.
Yeah.
Wow.
In a second pictograph, 8 people are carried away and saved from the flood.
Wow.
I mean, how
I know,
detailed
that's
and how
amazing.
specific.
That's revelation. That's
It's revelation.
God.
And they find that many different cultures in the world,
Awesome.
including the Chinese culture, have, again, prior to contact with Westerners, have these flood stories that
Wow.
have this kind of detail. And they are very similar to the Genesis flood. Let me come back to the fossil record for a moment. Here's some other fossil evidence. Again, the general fossil record doesn't show that these animals just kind of died, they got old, they died, they got preserved. They actually show catastrophic destruction of their habitat and of them. They are typically shown in violent poses of violent death, not natural death. And in all these fossil records, and we'll talk about this later, there are no intermediates between these different kinds of animals. There are no missing links. We'll talk about that more when we come to the biology area. Here's another interesting couple of facts. In a number of these areas of the fossil record, they find vertical fossilized trees going straight up through the rock record through millions and millions of years of ostensible rock formations.
That's crazy.
That is what the oldest tree you could ever imagine.
Yeah.
They've also found dinosaurs fossilized with their necks sticking up, again, through rock layers supposedly
Wow.
millions of years old. How do you explain that?
Wow.
It can't be explained other than consistent with a global flood. Any of you heard of Dr. Karl Ma?
Yeah.
Yeah,
the
Creation Evidence
Creation
Museum.
Evidence
Yep,
Museum.
yep.
Yeah, I've seen that.
He has in his fossil records
Texas.
a dinosaur footprint or track with a human footprint superimposed inside, which of course could only happen if both layers were soft before they were fossilized. Here's another area that's interesting. We think of dinosaur bones typically as things that are they are hard. They're hard rock. They're increasingly in dinosaur excavation finding dinosaur bones with bone protein still intact. So the interesting aspect of this is that it is widely known that bone protein could only have survived thousands of years, never millions of years. It's impossible. But they're increasingly finding this intact bone protein. How does that occur? It certainly refutes the idea of millions of years of life on Earth for these animals. Give you another final summary of some of the interesting areas with respect to fossils. In at least 3 major areas in fossil digs throughout the Earth, what they found is they've excavated plant-eating dinosaurs, herbivores. The interesting thing is that in the fossil record that they see, they do not see any of the plants that these herbivores would have eaten. How can that be? They would have to be. You see, if it's millions of years and these animals just died a natural death and were preserved, well then the plants that they ate would have to be preserved along with them.
Right.
The plants would die at roughly the same time as the animals do. You would see evidence of all that. The paleontologists are puzzled and perturbed. They have no explanation for it. But there is an explanation if you have a worldwide catastrophic flood. What happens is that the plants are deposited at the lower levels. They are deposited in levels. Plants at lower levels, they become now coral deposits. That's typically what plants become. And then the animals are deposited on a higher level or layer above them. Totally consistent again with a global flood doing this, but not consistent with long age. Let's look at the age of the earth.
All right, can I ask a question?
That's the first one. You can ask. Good. No, I wasn't trying to be snotty. Sure, absolutely.
Why are they not, did they see any human bones in the rocks and that kind of thing? Why is it all animal?
Well, they definitely do, but and so there's no question. So here, and I'll give you one interesting example. I mean, it's a very good question. So in this area where, for example, Dr. Baugh has a dinosaur footprint with a human footprint, superimposed,
Right.
it gives pretty clear evidence that they were coexisting.
Right.
And I mean, even through evolutionists and naturalists, they say can't be. It's impossible. Well, there it is. They've also found, Dr. Baugh as well, has found evidence of a human finger that is in an area that can only be in the dinosaur era, according to evolutionists. How does the human finger get there? He's taken it and had it analyzed by a fellow who's not a Christian, but who is an anatomist, because he said, his comment was, I don't want this to be looking like I've kind of kept it in-house among the Christians.
Right.
I'm going to give it to a guy who's not a believer.
Yeah.
Right.
You tell me what this is. He analyzed it. He said, this is the finger of a human being. It is female in approximately teenage years, and he was able to give complete detail.
Wow.
That's found in a layer that's only ascribed to dinosaurs, according to paleontologists.
Wow.
So there are these remains that are found, and I'm going to talk later on when
Okay.
we get on to about some of the human remains as well. I want to give you 6 examples of the age of the Earth. This is evidence for an Earth that's not as long as the naturalists say it is. Anybody heard? Nobody's not heard, I know, of Mount St. Helens. Mount St. Helens. May 18th, 1980. An example of catastrophism. A volcanic explosion caused by an earthquake. It had the force, they say, of 20,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs. It caused, get this, in a little lake at the foot of Mount St. Helens, an 850-foot high wave in a small lake. It created, this explosion, changes in a few months that to naturalists say would only take and could only take millions of years, at least hundreds of thousands of years. But what happened here is in Mount St. Helens, a perfect example of this rapid catastrophic event that looks like deep time, but is not. So here's an example of what happened after Mount St. Helens. It created a 1/40th scale model of the Grand Canyon in 20 years. Now the Grand Canyon's huge. A 1/40th scale model is a big model. It did it in 20 years. People who are naturalists say that this kind of thing can't happen this way. It can only happen through deep time. It created in that short period of time 400 feet thick sedimentary layers. That's pretty substantial.
Wow.
In a 20-year, actually less than a 20-year period. It created a 140-foot deep canyon system, 125-foot deep gullies in days. Not months, not years, in days. All these things that are examples to naturalists of structures that can only take millions of years to create. Here's the interesting point about this. Although Mount St. Helens had a distribution, I mean, even in Manitoba where we were living, we got hash from Mount St. Helens, but it was still a comparatively local event. This was not like a worldwide flood. This is not the same kind of force and power, as amazing as it was, as a worldwide flood would have had. Let's look at a second example, Georgia's Little Grand Canyon, called Providence Canyon. In the 1800s, the area where this canyon now is was flat farmland. In 1846, there was heavy rainfall and erosion that occurred. Gullies and crevices started to be formed. 100 years later, there's a deep canyon, and entire towns had to be moved and relocated from the canyon that was formed. Parts of the canyon are 15 stories deep. As of 2001, it has the same appearance as canyons claimed to have been formed over millions or billions of years. In 100 years. Carlsbad Canyons in New Mexico, anybody heard of them? Yeah. They are limestone caverns and formations, and they contain these stalagmites and stalactites, some coming up from the ground, some hanging from the roof. It's always been said by geologists in the past who are naturalists, this stuff can only form these structures, stalagmites, stalactites, over millions of years. Well, now they have found, to their surprise, that stalactites' growth of several inches per month is common. So now the millions of years have now been refuted by what? The best evidence. The best evidence in science is continually confirming the scriptures. So here's something that's really quite amusing. At the Carlsbad Caverns, prior to 1988, there was a sign that said 260 million years old. Then it was changed a number of years later to 7 to 10 million years old. Then it was changed to a sign that said 2 million years old. And now guess what? There's no sign. You can negotiate these guys down. You just have to use facts.
That's funny.
The age of the Grand Canyon. They used to say it was 65 million years old. Now they've decided it's 1 million years old. We'll get them down.
Yeah.
Petrifaction of wood. Petrified wood is said to can only occur over millions of years. Wood becoming stone. Well, it's now found that in the water conditions that would have occurred after a global flood, like it's described in Genesis, that wood could petrify in those conditions rapidly. And now a U.S. patent has been given to individuals who have established a process for causing rapid petrifaction of wood.
Yeah.
So all these things that have been held out as evidence of deep time are just falling left
They're
and
just
right.
crumbling.
Yeah, they're crumbling. The Earth's magnetic field. Naturalists say the Earth's magnetic field has existed for billions of years. Well, recent evidence has been showing that it is decaying rapidly, and that in the last 130 years it's decayed by a full 7%. Well, if it's decayed by 7% in the last 130 years, it's surely not billions of years old. And in fact, now new evidence is showing that the upper limit of the age of the magnetic field is no more than 10,000 years. Far cry from the millions and billions of years, depending on who's saying it. And they believe that at its current rate of decay, within about a couple of thousand years, it'll be completely gone, the magnetic field. What about radiometric dating? This is an area that becomes, controversial. Radioisotope dating, radiometric dating, things like carbon-14 and so forth. Because the naturalists say, this is it, guys. This is the evidence that the Earth is millions, or in their case, billions of years old. And so how do they do this? Well, what it involves is measuring the rate of change of one element into another. There are certain elements through radioactive decay form kind of they call it a parent to a daughter element. And they say, well, if we know, and what they do is they deal with this on the basis of what they call a half-life. So an example might be, this is just a rough and ready example, if you have a pound of a rock kind of thing, and I'm going to give you an example of potassium-40, which when it decays radioactively decays into argon, so it forms another element. So let's say you had a pound of rock, and half of it they look at and they say it's potassium-40 and half of it's argon. They say, oh, okay, obviously half of that potassium-40 has now changed into argon. And now they say, we know the half-life of this, how long it takes half of a chunk of rock to change into another. I'm giving you a rough and ready example. And often they'll say it's billions of years. Half-life of this is, so we know this is now, say 5 billion years old because of this. Carbon-14 is another example, as I mentioned. The problem with these things is that they are held out by naturalists to be rock solid, pun intended. But these methods, which are considered by them to be infallible, are actually based on certain assumptions and interpretations that they start off with. Here's two key assumptions that they always make. They're not based upon proven facts. It's not kind of like we got our device, we use our device to measure these rocks, and that's it. There's no other conclusion that you can come to. Every time that they do, that naturalists use these radiometric techniques, they make an assumption that that piece of rock, that 1 pound of rock, in the beginning was all potassium 40, and it's now changed. But no one was there when the rock was made. They have no basis to know what it originally was. So if you had, for example, a rock that actually originally was half potassium 40 and half argon, to give a rough example, there would have been no change that's taken place. But they always assume that every time that there was a change. It was originally one and now it's changed that, because it reinforces their view through this whole half-life technique that this is an old rock. The second thing that they assume is that decay rates in these rocks are always the same. They never change. It's always this long, slow decay process. Well, too bad for them. Because recently there has been findings that at least two phenomena physically, in the physics area, rapidly change radioactive decay rates. It can speed them up enormously. One is supernovas. When supernovas, stars that explode, give off radiation, it creates a huge acceleration in this radiometric decay in other rocks. A second one comes from what they call neutron stars. These are stars that have a life of only about 10,000 years, and they give off huge intensities of gamma rays, and apparently at certain times these rates greatly increase, and when they do it, it hugely accelerates this radioactive process of decay. So rather than having taken place over long periods of time, there are at least two forces that are now regularly and routinely speeding up radioactive decay. And that throws out the whole concept of this radiometric dating as being, this is a lock. This is absolutely proves the age of the rocks. Here's kind of an interesting circular process that naturalists go through. It's not science, it's worldview. They assume, to start off with, that there has been evolution, both cosmic and biological. And they assume that there has therefore been deep time, billions of years. Based on that, when they come to the fossil record, they say, well, obviously these fossils then are of huge age, millions and millions of years, because we know everything's been around for all these billions of years. Why? Because we accept that evolution is true. You start off with a worldview. They then say, okay, so because we know the age of these fossils that are in the rock, now we can date the rocks, because we know the age of the fossils. And now that we know that the rocks are this old because the fossils are this old, because we believe evolution is the case, they say that proves evolution. Anybody ever heard of circular reasoning?
Yeah.
But this is exactly the kind of reasoning that is typical in radiometric dating. So when somebody comes to you and tells you that, this is absolute and evident proof of the age of these rocks, sorry, it's riddled with flaws. And scientists are finding this more and more and admitting more and more that that this process is simply not anything like foolproof. And in fact, as we're going to see in a minute, I'll give you examples from the Grand Canyon, they are extremely flawed. So an example of the Grand Canyon is this. Radiometric tests have been done by taking the same rock and using different methods. There are different kinds of radiometric tests you can do. And these tests have sometimes resulted in differences of more than 400 million years in age. One test says, let's say, for example, it's 800 million years old. Another test says it's 400 million years old, or you get the point. Huge differences, same rock, different tests. But then they've also dated different rocks that geologists know are of different ages, no question, by the same method, different rocks, different ages known to geologists. They use the same method and test these two different rocks, and they find out they're the same age. And yet geologists know very well that they're not. So there are fundamental flaws in this. Here's the nicest one, the one that I find the most fun. Lava rock from Mount St. Helens, known to be 20 years old because it was observed during the time span of this eruption, has been dated by using radiometric tests from 1.3 to 3 million years old. But it's only 20 years old.
Big difference.
And this is, yes, and this has happened among other volcanic eruptions as well. As we come to wrap this part off in geology, there are other types of dating techniques for rocks. And they're not just these radiometric types. The interesting thing is that these non-radiometric tests, which also are well-established tests, show huge differences in dating from the radiometric ones. Radiometric ones showing millions of years, and the non-radiometric ones showing thousands of years. Here's two other examples. Comparisons have been made between the decay of carbon-14 on Earth and the rate of its production in the atmosphere. And this comparison has shown through a number of scientific tests to suggest an age of less than 10,000 years for the Earth's atmosphere. How about them apples? We're also finding that the amount of helium in the atmosphere is actually now more consistent with the biblical age than deep time. So some of these things are just falling by the wayside. You will never see this taught, though, in the public sphere or square. Grady McMurtry is a Christian and a creationist, and he's made an interesting example. We know that rivers, and particularly the major rivers of the world, carry silt in them from their source to their mouth. They carry the silt, and they deposit the silt at the mouth. If we have an old Earth, we obviously have old rivers. We're talking about the major rivers of the world, you know, the Nile, the Amazon, the St. Lawrence, the Mississippi, the Colorado. There should be evidence of millions of years of silt deposits at the mouth. Do you know how many years of silt deposits have been found at the mouth of all these major rivers? 4,500 years of silt deposits.
Wow.
So let me read you one conclusion of a world-class geologist. The correspondence between the global catastrophe in the geological record and the flood described in Genesis is much too obvious for me not to conclude that these events must be one and the same. With this crucial linkage between the biblical record and the geological record, a straightforward reading of the earlier chapters of Genesis is a next logical step. The conclusion is that the creation of the cosmos, the earth, plants, animals, as well as man and woman by God took place just as it is described only a few thousand years ago, with no need for qualification or apology. This comes from Dr. John R. Baumgartner. He has a master's in electrical engineering from Princeton, MS and PhD in geophysics and space physics from UCLA, and he's a technical staff member in the theoretical division of the Los Alamos National Laboratory. So it's not so straightforward as the naturalists say. Okay, so let's move from geology to origins of life and the evidence of microbiology. And Kevin, you'll sing out whenever the break is.
You could do it now or 7:45, whatever works better for you, Scott.
Why don't we plow through for a bit? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Does that
Yeah.
work? Okay.
Oh.
Psalm 14, verse 1. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. So then, how did life begin? We look back at the worldviews. So let's look at the biblical account, the biblical worldview. Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created. And we know that as Genesis goes on, the details of him creating the physical earth, the heavens, and all life is clearly set out. John 1, verses 1 to 3. He created through Jesus the Word. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And it goes on to say, without him, nothing has been made that has been made. It was through the instrumentality of Jesus. That's the biblical worldview. what's the naturalist approach to origins of life? The same as it is in terms of the cosmic view of naturalists. Everything that occurs only came through natural material causes. What started the first glob of matter then, if everything just came through? We don't know, but we know it was only material. We know there's no creator. Good logic. So the naturalist approach says, of course, that evolution, both cosmic and biological, has what has been that creates everything that exists today. Here's an example of a naturalist worldview from William Provine, professor of biological sciences at Cornell University. Let me summarize my views on what modern evolutionary biology tells us loud and clear. There are no gods, no purposes, no goal-directed forces of any kind. There is no life after death. When I die, I am absolutely certain that I'm going to be dead. That's the end for me. And then he goes on to tell us a little bit more that shows clearly worldview. There is no ultimate foundation for ethics, no ultimate meaning to life, and no free will for humans either.
Wow.
This guy needs an antidepressant.
Yeah. Poor thing.
Around him. Yeah.
And here's where a viewpoint like Provine's leads us. Anybody heard of Peter Singer? He is a Yale ethics professor. I use the word loosely. Ethics. This is not an exaggeration, folks. This is where the view of Provine leads us. Peter Singer has said that parents ought to be able to decide up to the age of 2 years old for their children whether their children live or die, because they are not fully human until after 2 years of age. I have read his writings.
Wow.
He is still an ethics professor at Princeton University. How can that be?
I've never heard.
How can that be? He has also said that if you're going to choose experimentation on animals scientifically, if you have a disabled human or a chimpanzee, you would always choose the disabled human to perform the experiments on.
What?
This is not exaggeration.
He
folks.
said those words?
Absolutely. Look him up sometime.
And he gave him a
Yeah.
job.
One of the other wackos in his group said that children aren't humans until they're 12, I think.
Wow.
They-
Well, and that's it. Isn't that the case, Greg? I mean, the sky becomes the limit once you now say that there is no basis for ethics.
Right.
There's no basis for anything that is absolute.
On steroids.
Yeah,
It's
it's,
like-
yeah, it's, so, I mean,
Oh my
this is the
God.
extraordinary age that we are in, folks. How can he still be a professor?
That's what I'm
I
saying.
at Princeton
understand
University?
that.
How do the students listen to that?
I
Like,
I
understand.
just,
Because they're all indoctrinated.
Well,
They
that's-
haven't been prepared.
That's the thing, and they call us foolish, naive.
yeah, right, yeah, that's
oh my God, that just sounds so.
It's extraordinary. So, that's the naturalist viewpoint.
Well, I
We've
think
talked
like-
about the biblical.
Like the king's jester once said to the king when the king asked, was making fun of the jester said, "I'm God's fool. Whose fool are you, king?"
Yeah, exactly.
Oh my.
So intelligent design and creationism says clearly that there is intelligent design in the universe, and that evidence in the biological creation points to a creator. Here's an important thing when we're talking about the whole area of science. There are two types of science. Greg is a physician, he's a man of science, and he will understand this. There's experimental science and forensic science. So experimental science is something like this. You get a theory, and now you test that theory against repeated observations or tests. So for example, if I say, I think if I take 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom and I put them together, it's going to create a liquid which I'll call water. You might say, well, that's great, I've claimed to do that. You have to repeat this again. This is not just a one-off. And then other people, independent of you, repeat it again to show that it's not a one-off. It's a repeatable, current, observable event. And then if it is concluded by repeated observation that the same thing happens, you've now proven something on your theory. But forensic science is something very different. In forensic science, a theory is developed about past unobserved events. And when we come to the whole area of the origins of life, this is what we're dealing with. We're not dealing with experimental science, we're dealing with forensic science, because nobody was there. Detectives do forensic science. Nobody was there to see the event. They have to go back and look for clues, and they use scientific means to try and reconstruct a plausible explanation for this past event. Who killed so-and-so, for example? It's not repeatable. Origins of life again. No one was there except God. There's something I think is important for us to know, is that there is no absolute final scientific proof of creationism and intelligent design or evolution. There simply isn't. Because in the end, no one was there. But what we can do, because what we're dealing with is people having different interpretations of the same facts. We're all looking at the same facts. We're looking at life and what's happening in life, but we come to different conclusions. What we can do, though, even though we can't come to some absolute proof that we can put under somebody's nose and say it proves there's a creator, we can point to compelling evidence. And what's the most compelling evidence? Is there a creator or is there not? Let me read you another statement here. Look at the right one. From another scientist. Here's a fellow who sort of, despite himself, he's a geneticist, an evolutionist. He said something that was, I guess, certainly at least honest. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life. No knock on you, Greg, or the physicians. In spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. There's the worldview. It's not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori, that means independent of experience, adherence to material causes, to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. He says, in other words, if some of our science doesn't make any sense at all, we still have to stick to it. And here's the last statement. Moreover, that materialism is an absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. See, this is worldview. We don't want God.
Right.
Yeah, that's
And
it.
we will do
Right.
everything we can in our power to establish that it's all by material
Right.
chance because of that. So let's look at Darwinism
Oh my God.
and
that's like
Darwinistic
Romans-
evolution.
Someone.
It's like Romans 1 all over. I mean,
There we go.
Romans 1.
Here's what Darwinism says. Here's a summary. All life comes from natural causes based on chance. At some point, inorganic molecules, which is non-living chemicals or matter, formed organic molecules, which is living matter, spontaneously. They don't explain how. Then organic molecules caused a primitive, original, simple cell. That primitive cell evolved to complex life. How? Through mutation, by forces like cosmic radiation, and time, and natural selection. And they have their holy trinity I mentioned yesterday, matter, time, and chance. What they say is that many small changes now occur on our original simple single cell, and those small changes by mutation over deep time, millions and millions of years, create from a common ancestor developments into new species until you come to us. The interesting thing is that mutation actually are mistakes in the DNA. They are random errors in the genetic structure of an organism that's passed on to the offspring. These are not positive things. And they have a mantra that they use, and it is, nature does not make leaps. Nature is slow, painstaking, gradual, over millions of years. And this characteristic or character of natural selection has almost become personified. It's as though there is some kind of an almost mystical type of entity called natural selection that somehow guides this whole process, that results in what this cute little saying goes, from the goo to the zoo,
Mm.
to you. And that's kind of their little summary. So what they say about natural selection is this, is that when these changes are made, these mutations, these mistakes in the genetic code, that natural selection is this sort of force that favors positive changes but discards negative or neutral changes. Natural selection, they say, has to use working systems, so that if genetic changes occur through mutation and somehow, mystifyingly, a working system is created, natural selection says, you pass go, you collect $200, you continue on. But if it's not that, if it's not a working system, it goes into the trash bin of natural history through natural selection. And then, of course, we come to the term, and this makes sort of at least an understanding of the term, survival of the fittest.
Okay.
Only the working systems with positive changes go forward. So then, if we say this doesn't make sense, based upon evidence we're starting to see, one question you may be asked at some point by people is, well, if you say that there is not this evolution, what about intra-species changes? In other words, changes within species. Well, there, we can agree with people that there are intra-species changes, because we're talking what they call microevolution, changes within a species as opposed to changes between one species to another, of which there is no evidence, we're going to see. So we have varieties in different animals. We have varieties, for example, in dogs. We have, for example, on the one hand, a Great Dane, the other hand, a Chihuahua, which is a bad example because a Chihuahua is not a dog. But let me give you, how nobody here has a Chihuahua? Start to duck.
Well, I have a Yorkie.
Well, he gets passed.
Okay.
He gets passed. So the conclusion of Darwinism is that we have this ongoing upward progress from this original simple single cell, eventually to organisms, eventually to fish, eventually to amphibians, eventually to reptiles, eventually to birds, to mammals, to man. And so the next stage is maybe X-Man. But, you know, I'm making kind of a joke about that, but that's what that whole concept is about. The X-Men concept is through genetic mutations.
Oh, yeah.
We have these positive changes that take
The
place, and
X-Men.
now we got some kinds of superheroes.
Yeah.
It makes great movies. I watch them,
Me too, I love
but it doesn't make good reality. So how does, you want me to stop here, sir? Okay, great. If we could even take a shorter break, if that's okay with you guys, that would work well.
So what is that crazy guy's name?
Which one?
The one that says
Professor?
the kids are not
Oh,
people
Peter,
until they're
Peter Singer.
Peter
Singer.
Singer.
Yep.
Wommack.
You might want to look at that. It's so